For that, we are going to talk to our next guest, a contributor to Open Democracy and political analyst at the Kingston University here in London. Mr. Nikolai Due-Gundersen is with us on the line. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Draft Time Show, Nikolai.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us today. You are well familiar with, Middle Eastern politics, having studied most of the regions in that area. What's your reaction to this conflict specifically?
Well, on the one hand, I'm not surprised because this spat, if you like, between Qatar and the GCC is not new. However, this looks like it's becoming quite a protracted blockade, and that in itself is new, and I'm curious what's going to happen. I certainly feel that Qatar's isolation may have long-term effects on GCC unity against, for example, ISIS. On the other hand, we did see a reversal from the United States regarding so-called terrorist links and Qatar when we had this $12 billion fighter jet deal that I'm sure you heard about. And recently, now we have government officials in the U.S. questioning the blockade.
Well, I mean, the intention of the Arab states, because, for example, I'll tell you about myself. For a very long time, not long time, but for a few days, I did not know about this. And then I thought about the intentions of the Arab states. What do you think the GCC and also the Arab states, what are they trying to get at? I mean, is it to isolate Qatar politically or pressurize it financially, or is there anything else that we need to be looking at?
Well, it is, in a sense, a political statement. I think also since Trump's visit to the GCC, they seem a lot more emboldened. The GCC is effectively a Saudi-led bloc, and you've mentioned earlier, Qatar's media presence, for example, and the kind of pressure that presence has put on some of the Gulf monarchies. Certainly, I think that this blockade is, among other things, a response to that, and it is an attempt by Saudi Arabia and GCC allies to put pressure on Qatar and to basically stop them from punching above their weight. So we have to remember that Qatar has a lot of wealth in gas. It has a very small populace, which means that at a time when oil prices are low, Qatar still has financial leverage to play ball in the GCC court and in the region. That should be remembered.
Yeah.
So, what will be the implication of this conflict on the rest of the Middle East then?
Well, I will certainly be looking at Iran and Turkey, of course, and what's going to happen with those two, especially if Qatar is receiving aid from Iran and from Turkey. I mean, we've heard about Oman sending food aid to Qatar. However, they only did so after Iran began sending food aid, and now there's talk of Turkey, sending in troops and also trying to get in on business deals in Qatar. I would also want to look at what will happen with energy firms that are active in the GCC and in that region, because there are a lot of large oil and gas firms that have close relations with Qatar that care about the LNG sector, liquefied natural gas sector, and just the amount that Qatar has. So I would certainly be watching the trend for these political actors and, again, looking at the stability of the Gulf region, because in a sense, we've seen North Africa going down. We've seen the Levant going down with Syria, and now the GCC and the Gulf is sort of the last stable part of the MENA region, if you like, apart from Yemen, of course. So I would certainly be on the lookout for these factors.
Yeah. I mean, we spoke earlier on to Ihsan, and he described the situation as a not a conflict, but just because all the regions, we cannot simply identify that this particular area is supporting terrorists and the other is not. And now, do you think Saudis are then right to blame Qatar for supporting terrorism? Because some people say it's as if the pot is calling the kettle black.
Well, I think that you've hit the nail on the head there, and I know your previous guest also mentioned this briefly, but when it comes to the supporting of terrorism, the question becomes whose hands are really clean. I think that, in the case of Saudi Arabia, they're active in Yemen. There are some who argue that they have allowed the financing of Wahhabism to spread and influence other groups such as ISIS.
Yeah.
So I think that it's not a simple, clear-cut case of terrorism. In a sense, the so-called terrorists and these accusations against Qatar are, I suppose, political excuses that can be used to mask the desire to muscle Qatar out and to blockade them and to minimize their political clout in the GCC region.
So what about Qatar then? I mean, they according to them, they're actually doing more than anyone to counter terrorism. What do you have to say about that then?
Well, I think that Qatar, one of the interesting things about Qatar, which was mentioned by one of your previous guests, is that they have the largest U.S. airbase in the region, the Al Udeid airbase, and they have just struck this $12 billion fighter jet deal. So certainly, if the United States seriously considered Qatar to be a terrorist threat, they would not have gone ahead with this deal. And at the same time, returning to the previous question of is the pot calling the kettle black? Both Qatar and other GCC states are funding various rebels in Syria, for example, in some cases rebel groups, and that should also be remembered. So it's not a simple case of are they countering terrorism or are they funding terrorism?
Just at the end of the day, Nikolai, why is it that out of all the Middle Eastern states, only two, namely Iran and Turkey, they have shown some sort of support for Qatar?
Well, if I may first tackle Iran, I think that it must be remembered that Qatar and Iran, they share one of the largest gas fields in the world. So it is in Iran's interest to have friendly relations with Qatar. At the same time, I think that we can now return to the discussion of Qatar's media and the Arab Spring, and the coverage, the intense coverage of certain allies of GCC states that have been overthrown, and how Qatar's coverage made some of the kingdoms in the Gulf scared. And so we're really seeing this GCC blockade is also, in a sense, an answer to some of these concerns where they felt that Qatar has tried to push political clout quite strongly. And so now we're seeing that Iran is getting in to support Qatar because it feels that it has a chance. And at the same time, perhaps we can mention the little, some people call it the internal coup that happened in Saudi Arabia, where there's a new crown prince who is very much against Iran. And so Iran, they feel that now is a good chance to have an ally in Qatar, and Turkey may also be thinking the same.
All right. Well, let's see what the future holds then. Nikolai, thank you very much for joining us today, contributor to Open Democracy and political analyst at the Kingston University, Mr. Nikolai Due-Gundersen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
0208687